Hey, it's Russell Graves coming to you from the barn at Hackberry Farm. And have you ever wondered why when you shoot a picture in the outdoors, sometimes the exposure's off? Well, stay tuned because in this video, I'm going to show you the simple reason why, and more importantly, what you can do to correct it. Since I started taking pictures, all cameras are calibrated the same way, to this 18% gray. And what that means is if you look at a histogram, on one side you'll have a point that is purely black, on the other side you'll have a point that is purely white, and in the middle that's 18% gray. And the advantage of all the cameras being calibrated in the same way, that no matter whether you pick up a Canon or a Nikon or an Olympus or a Sony, is that they all should read the same scene roughly in the same way and suggest the same shutter speed, ISO setting, aperture, all that stuff that goes into your exposure. They all ought to read roughly the same way. But because they are calibrated at 18% gray, sometimes that throws a little bit of a monkey wrench into your exposure, especially under certain conditions when you're trying to shoot wildlife pictures in the outdoors. So my setup here is pretty simple. I've got this little zebra here. I've got it on a neutral tone background, something like you'd see in nature. This could be grass, it could be sky, something that's kind of in that 18% gray range. I've got my camera set on aperture priority because that's usually what I shoot on. And then my ISO, if you look, it's set at 400. And then I've got the f-stop set at 4.0. And if I activate the meter, you can see there, the camera thinks it ought to be 1/125th of a second. And we can look at the histogram and see that most of that's kind of scooted towards the middle. If you notice my exposure meter at the bottom is zeroed out right in the middle. It's exactly where the camera thinks it ought to be. And so for a lot of cases in outdoor photography, most cases I would say, metering like this works fine, but you've got to pay attention to the background. So we're going to switch the backgrounds out a couple of times and see how that affects these same settings. If you notice, everything stayed the same. The light source hasn't moved. The ISO is the same, the f-stop's the same, but all of a sudden, if you look at our picture, the white background looks gray because look where the histogram is. It's peaking right in the middle of that gray. Because camera meters, since they're calibrated at 18% gray, it tries to push all the scenes into that same little box. Now, you may recognize this before because we've all done this. When you're shooting pictures on the snow, the first couple of times you do it till you figure it out, you realize that when you take pictures of an animal in the snow, the camera wants to push everything to 18% gray, and so the snow looks gray and kind of dull, just like in this case here. Again, nothing about this scene has changed except for the background. I put a white background in, the light source is the same, the ISO is the same, the f-stop's the same, but let's look what happens to the shutter speed. Instead of what it was earlier, now it's 1/400th of a second. Because you can see here that the camera tends to underexpose the image when you have a bright background. That's important to remember. If you have a bright background, the camera tends to underexpose the image, and we just made it do it right there. And so how do you compensate for that? Well, what I do is I'll look at a picture, and if it looks too dark like this one does, I know I've got to add light or plus on my exposure compensation. If you use manual, you can do the same thing. And so I'm going to plus on the exposure compensation. And when I look at that, now all of a sudden the snow looks more like snow. Of course, we've got the shadow off to the right of the zebra, but the zebra is more properly exposed. And so usually in an outdoor situation, you've got to overexpose or plus on the plus side of your exposure meter. Anytime you've got a mid-tone animal on a bright background, we could even, as an experiment, we could even go plus 2 stops. And that may be getting a little bit out of range. We're not clipping if you look at the histogram, but maybe about 1.33 stops looks about right. That's a good guideline. Almost every picture I've ever taken in the snow, you always have to add exposure compensation, add light to it. The camera, when it takes it, it thinks it sees all that bright in the background. It tries to bring it to middle tone. And in the result, you're going to have an image that looks too dark, so we have to add light or plus on the exposure compensation. So what do you think is going to happen when we put a dark background behind it? Well, let's find out. Okay, we reset everything. The light source is the same. The ambient light coming around it's the same. The ISO is the same. The f-stop's the same. But what's different about it now, instead of a middle tone or a bright background, we just changed it out to a dark background. And if you notice here, the camera, even though it's a little bit closer in this particular scenario, the camera still, if you look at the light on the back of the animal, it's almost tending to overexpose it. And you can look at the histogram there and see that everything's kind of shoved off to one side. So if we look at the shutter speed on this, you'll notice, let me press the button here, it's 1/50th of a second. Now earlier with the mid-tone background it was 1/125th of a second. So now because of that dark background, it's causing the camera to tend to let more light in or overexpose it to some degree. You can look at the back of the Zebra again and see where it's starting to kind of get to where it's going to overexpose. And so the way we fix that is just like we did on the snow earlier, that if an image is too bright, like if we look at over the rump of the Zebra, if you'll notice that the black background is not quite black, it's too bright. So if it's too bright, we have to take light away or minus light from the image. So we're just going to move our exposure compensation over to maybe as much as a stop and see what that looks like. Now you can see the shadow looks more like the shadow's supposed to be. It's a little dark on this right side, but you get the point. We can even open that up a little bit and just go 2/3 of a stop. Go 2/3 of a stop. That looks a little better. But my point is, dark backgrounds make cameras tend to overexpose the image. Bright backgrounds tend to make the camera underexpose an image. So if you're aware of that when you're in the field, then you can use exposure compensation if you use one of the shutter priority modes, or you can dial it in manually. Whatever way you do will work the same either way. But the point is, the camera's going to be telling you all along that the exposure's not right. You just got to trust the system and trust that you know better than the camera knows. So the whole point of this exercise is to show you that even though the light source can stay the same, the settings on your camera can stay the same, the minute the background changes, it has a huge influence on the exposure and what the camera thinks the exposure ought to be for that picture. So the best thing for you to do is just outthink your camera. And I'm telling you, I've shot millions of pictures, I've crunched the numbers. Almost all the time in the outdoors, if you've got a middle tone subject with a dark background, the camera is going to tend to overexpose by one stop. And conversely, if you've got the same middle tone subject on a snowy background, the camera is going to tend to underexpose by a stop. So really all you have to do if you shoot aperture or shutter priority, use your exposure compensation, either do a +1, add light when you need it when the camera is underexposing, or -1, minus light when you need to when the camera is overexposing. So +1 or -1 depending on the situation. Or if you shoot manual, just dial it in manual. Remember, your camera is going to tell you got the exposure wrong. Use your intuition, use what you learned here, and it'll help you get better exposures and more accurate exposures when you're in the field.